Not long ago, Glynis pointed out that climate change is the biggest question mark in science at the moment. I told her I'd look into it. I first came into contact with climate change about 35 years ago. The Larousse Astronomy had an in-depth section on the Sun. Since about 1610, a major interest in astronomy was observation of the Sun's activity. The definitive measure was the number of sunspots recorded each year. Measurements started just after the medieval warm spell, which had been known for abundant harvests and general prosperity. In England, good harvests of grapes were noted by Chaucer, even in the northernmost parts of the country. But before sunspot measurements started, the temperature had been falling. By 1610, sunspots were in short supply. From 1645 to 1700, there were almost none. The dearth of sunspots was called the Maunder minimum, after the British astronomer Maunder, the head of the Greenwich Observatory at the end of the 19th century. Maunder collected and collated the observations from records in observatories throughout Europe. The Maunder minimum coincided with a period called the Little Ice Age. This was a time when even the tidal river Thames froze in winter. Harvests were meagre and famine and poverty were the order of the day. But in 1700, the sun began to become active again. It was soon noticed that when there were sunspots, the climate became warmer. With a few ups and downs, the sunspots have generally increased and temperatures have risen since the Little Ice Age. But we still have a long way to go before we reach the temperatures and the bumper harvests of the medieval warm spell. In the last decade of the 20th century, Al Gore, an American politician, started putting himself forward as an expert in the atmospheric sciences. He produced a video called An Inconvenient Truth, in which he told us that increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere leads to global warming.
We're going back in time now, 650,000 years. Here's what the temperature has been on our Earth. Now, one thing that kind of jumps out at you is, did they ever fit together? Most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. The relationship is actually very complicated, but there is one relationship that is far more powerful than all the others, and it is this. When there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer.
I heard quite a few predictions that Al Gore was going to become very rich out of carbon dioxide. Those predictions turned out to be correct. His claims about it were later shown to be false. But the story was immediately taken up by a rapidly growing army of environmentalists. They were soon joined by frustrated left-wingers whose beloved communism had collapsed with the Berlin Wall. They wanted a new cause for berating capitalism.
Are some of the worst climate criminals on the planet.
The media joined in wholeheartedly. Global warming rapidly became a vast political agenda in which carbon dioxide was the villain of the piece, a villain sure to cause disaster in the near future. And this was really quite surprising, since carbon dioxide is known as the gas of life. It's the raw material for photosynthesis. Plants can't produce food without it, and the more plentiful the CO2, the more abundantly they produce. And without plants, there would be no animal life. It's also essential for respiration. The blood can't absorb oxygen very well, but rather it changes place with carbon dioxide. If you buy an oxygen cylinder for medical use, it has carbon dioxide in the cylinder at a higher concentration than in the atmosphere. Without the CO2, oxygen is not very effective for respiration, and the concentration of this gas of life in the atmosphere is astoundingly low, at only 0.05%. In an amazingly short time, vast numbers of people were involved in a new craze, climate militancy, in which the gas of life was the enemy. And a group of top climate scientists tried to bring a little sanity to the story. They produced a television documentary, The Great Global Warming Swindle, which is freely available on the internet and well worth watching. They presented a sober account, including data which refuted Al Gore's alarmist story.
The relationship is actually very complicated, but there is one relationship that is far more powerful than all the others, and it is this. When there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer.
Al Gore says the relationship between temperature and CO2 is complicated, but he doesn't say what those complications are. In fact, there was something very important in the ice core data that he failed to mention. Professor Ian Clark is a leading Arctic paleoclimatologist who looks back into the Earth's temperature record tens of millions of years.
When we look at climate on long scales, we're looking for geological material that actually records climate. If we're to take an ice sample, for example, we use isotopes to reconstruct temperature, but the atmosphere that's imprisoned in that ice, we liberate, and then we look at the CO2 content.
Professor Clark and others have indeed discovered, as Al Gore says, a link between carbon dioxide and temperature. But what Al Gore doesn't say is that the link is the wrong way round.
So here we're looking at the ice core record from Vostok, and in the red we see temperature going up from early time to later time at a very key interval when we came out of a glaciation. And we see the temperature going up, and then we see the CO2 coming up. CO2 lags behind that increase. It's got an 800-year lag, so temperature is leading CO2 by 800 years.
There have now been several major ice core surveys. Every one of them shows the same thing. The temperature rises or falls, and then, after a few hundred years, carbon dioxide follows.
So obviously, carbon dioxide is not the cause of that warming. In fact, we can say that the warming produced the increase in carbon dioxide.
CO2 clearly cannot be causing temperature changes. It's a product of temperature. It's following temperature changes.
The ice core record goes to the very heart of the problem we have here. They said, if the CO2 increases in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, then the temperature will go up. But the ice core record shows exactly the opposite. So the fundamental assumption, the most fundamental assumption of the whole theory of climate change due to humans is shown to be wrong.
Amid all the hectic vilification of CO2, scientists who were actually involved with climate came to the conclusion that CO2 does not explain climate change observations. They also remembered that for over 400 years astronomy had accepted that climate change was due to variation in the sun's activity, as witnessed by sunspot counts. But the most interesting thing about all this research for me is that although it shows rise in CO2 follows rise in temperature, which wipes out the idea that warming is caused by increase in CO2, and that although almost all the scientists involved realize that the well-established and long-accepted science linking climate change to the sun is sound, nevertheless, the global warming story, although shown to be false, has produced an apparently unstoppable industry, with thousands of people making a very good living from it, and thousands of researchers finding very easy access to research funds if they support the story, but little or no funding if they do not.
The most politically incorrect thing possible is to doubt this climate change orthodoxy.
Yet, as the frenzy over man-made global warming grows shriller, many senior climate scientists say the actual scientific basis for the theory is crumbling.
When people say we don't believe in global warming, I say, no, I believe in global warming. I don't believe that human CO2 is causing that warming.
Anyone who goes around and says that carbon dioxide is responsible for most of the warming of the 20th century hasn't looked at the basic numbers.
A few years ago, if you would ask me, I would tell you it's CO2. Why? Because just like everyone else in the public, I listened to what the media had to say. There were periods, for example, in Earth's history when we had 3 times as much CO2 as we have today, or periods when we had 10 times as much CO2 as we have today. And if CO2 has a large effect on climate, then you should see it in the temperature reconstruction.
If we look at climate through the geological time frame, we would never suspect CO2 as a major climate driver.
None of the major climate changes in the last 1,000 years can be explained by CO2.
We can't say that CO2 will drive climate. It certainly never did in the past.
I've often heard it said that there is a consensus of thousands of scientists on the global warming issue and that humans are causing a catastrophic change to the climate system. Well, I am one scientist, and there are many that simply think that is not true.
Man-made global warming is no ordinary scientific theory.
This morning, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made up of...
It is presented in the media as having the stamp of authority of an impressive international organization.
From the IPCC, the
United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC.
The IPCC, like any UN body, is political. The final conclusions are politically driven.
This claim that the IPCC is the world's top 1,500 or 2,500 scientists, you look at the bibliographies of the people and it's simply not true. There are quite a number of non-scientists.
And to build the number up to 2,500, they have to start taking reviewers and government people and so on, anyone who ever came close to them. And none of them are asked to agree. Many of them disagree.
Those people who are specialists but don't agree with the polemic and resign, and there have been a number that I know of, they are simply put on the author list and become part of this 2,500 of the world's top scientists.
People have decided you have to convince other people that since no scientist disagrees, you shouldn't disagree either. But that, whenever you hear that in science, that's pure propaganda.
Climate scientists need there to be a problem in order to get funding.
There's one thing you shouldn't say, and that is, this might not be a problem.
Fact of the matter is that tens of thousands of jobs depend upon global warming right now. It's a big business.
It's become a great industry in itself. And if the whole global warming farrago collapsed, there'd be an awful lot of people out of jobs and looking for work.
I have seen and heard their spitting fury at anybody who might disagree with them, which is not the scientific way.
It is a story about Westerners invoking the threat of climatic disaster to hinder vital industrial progress in the developing world.
One clear thing that emerges from the whole environmental debate is the point that there's somebody keen to kill the African dream, and the African dream is to develop.
The environmental movement has evolved into the strongest force there is for preventing development in the developing country.
We had a very, very thorough inquiry, took evidence from a whole lot of people expert in this area and produced a report. What surprised me was to discover how weak and uncertain the science was. In fact, there are more and more thoughtful people, some of them a little bit frightened to come out in the open, but who quietly, privately, and some of them publicly, are saying, hang on, wait a minute, this simply doesn't add up.
Since the mid-19th century, the Earth's temperature has risen by just over 0.5 degrees Celsius. But this warming began long before cars and planes were even invented. What's more, most of the rise in temperature occurred before 1940, during a period when industrial production was relatively insignificant. After the Second World War, during the post-war economic boom, temperatures, in theory, should have shot up. But they didn't. They fell. Not for 1 or 2 years, but for 4 decades. In fact, paradoxically, it wasn't until the world economic recession in the 1970s that they stopped falling. What they found was an incredibly close correlation between what the sun was doing and changes in temperature on Earth. Solar activity, they found, rose sharply to 1940, fell back for 4 decades until the 1970s, and then rose again after that. So Professor Friis Christiansen and his colleagues examined 400 years of astronomical records to compare sunspot activity against temperature variation. Once again, they found that variations in solar activity were intimately linked to temperature variation on Earth. It was the sun, it seemed, not carbon dioxide or anything else, that was driving changes in the climate. In 2005, astrophysicists from Harvard University published the following graph in the official journal of the American Geophysical Union. The blue line represents temperature change in the Arctic over the past 100 years. And here is the rise in carbon dioxide over the same period. The two are not obviously connected, but now look again at the temperature record, and at this red line, which depicts variations in solar activity over the past century as recorded independently by scientists from NASA and America's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Solar activity over the last 100 years, over the last several hundred years, correlates very nicely on a decadal basis with sea ice and Arctic temperatures.
To the Harvard astrophysicists and many other scientists, the conclusion is inescapable.
The sun is driving climate change. CO2 is irrelevant.
It's become, in effect, the accepted paradigm, and anyone who goes against the paradigm risks the unbridled wrath of the establishment. And acceptance of a paradigm always brings subjection to the so-called best-in-the-field theory, with its consequent dishonesty. There's a very sad example of this in a debate in which Craig Eatso puts forward a straightforward, well-reasoned account of why the dominant story is not proven and should be considered speculative rather than factual. Then Geoffrey Bennett, who proudly introduces himself as an astronomer, not an atmospheric scientist, puts forward the atmosphere of Venus as solid proof that the CO2 paradigm is true.
I'm going to start with a caveat. I'm an astronomer, not a climate scientist, so there's plenty of intricacies of climate science that I can't speak to with authority. However, it turns out that astronomy offers a really good way to approach this topic in terms of understanding what the actual evidence is. So I'm going to start with what I like to call a tale of two planets here. So what you see on the screen is Earth and Venus. And so that brings us back to wrapping up our tale of two planets. On Earth, we have enough greenhouse gas existing in our atmosphere naturally to make our planet livable. Venus has so much carbon dioxide in its atmosphere that it creates an extreme greenhouse effect that explains that very, very high temperature. And so I like to put it this way: if the greenhouse effect is a good thing for life on Earth, Venus is absolute proof that it is possible to have too much of a good thing. And that is where scientific concern about global warming begins, because we know carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and we know that its concentration is indeed rising.
I suspect that most of people watching the debate would be impressed by this astronomer's authoritative presentation. But there's a major problem. When the first satellite descended onto Venus, astronomers were astounded at the high temperatures on the surface. They had known that the atmosphere was mostly carbon dioxide, but that had not prepared them for the measured temperature. Carl Sagan, probably the most famous astronomer of that time, attributed the high temperatures to vast layers of concentrated sulfuric acid in the lower atmosphere. There are graphs of temperature variation in the atmosphere of Venus. As one descends through the thick blanket of carbon dioxide, there's surprisingly little temperature rise. In fact, we can see the temperature is getting gradually colder until we reach the sulfuric acid mist at about 95 kilometers above the surface. The temperature there is about 120 above absolute zero. In the sulfuric acid, the temperature starts to rise at a rapidly increasing rate until the bottom of the sulfuric acid layer, about 25 kilometers above the surface, where the temperature is about 600 degrees absolute. Then the increase starts to slow down a little and reaches about 750 absolute at the surface. We can see why Carl Sagan attributed the high temperature to sulfuric acid. But we might ask, why didn't Geoffrey Bennett even mention it? And there's something about Venus that Carl Sagan probably knew nothing about. The astronomers today do know. Since the Venus rover very quickly broke down under concentrated acid rain at temperatures well over 400 centigrade, later explorers would put in orbit above the sulfuric acid layers. They take images in various wavelengths which penetrate the sulfuric acid clouds. Those images are used to reconstruct the planet's surface. The reconstructions show the surface to be covered with volcanoes. There are vastly more volcanoes on Venus than on any other planet. Pictures taken a few months apart show remoulding of the surface of some of these volcanoes. This suggests that lava flows are not uncommon. Volcanoes are possibly another contributor to the high surface temperature of Venus. But Geoffrey Bennett didn't even mention that either. He only showed that Venus has far more carbon dioxide than Earth, and gave the impression that is the only relevant difference. Presumably, he was banking on the fact that none of the listeners knew much about astronomy. Such blatant dishonesty is a common feature of subjection to the best in the field dictum. Throwing doubt on the ruling paradigm is likely to rouse the fury of the establishment. Confirmation of the paradigm reaps promotion and easy access to research grants. Well, there's far too much to look into in just one episode. And we've not even reached a possible reason for why climate change became the ruling paradigm with such stunning speed and power. So let's look at that next time. And let's not forget a warning we've been given about believing what we want to believe. There is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. They all look to their own way, every one for his gain from his quarter. And more importantly, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. Thank you for joining me for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and press the bell so that you'll be notified as I release new movies. If you'd like to support this project, you're welcome to do so through Patreon. Find a link on my channel banner and in the description below.